In Virginia during the dark days of slavery, something utterly baffling was unfolding. For months, plantation owners noticed a strange pattern. Their female slaves were disappearing without explanation. Entire groups vanished overnight, leaving behind fear, confusion, and mounting frustration. Despite exhaustive searches, patrols, and interrogations, no one could figure out where these women were going, or how they managed to vanish so completely. What authorities and slaveholders eventually discovered was so shocking, so seemingly impossible, that it challenged everything they thought they knew about control, power, and the resilience of those who were enslaved. This was no ordinary escape. It was a story of cunning, bravery, and ingenuity that defied the cruel systems of the time. In the heart of Virginia during the era when slavery cast its dark shadow over the lives of thousands, an inexplicable phenomenon began to unfold, one that would confound slaveholders and authorities alike. For months, female slaves began disappearing from plantations across the region, vanishing seemingly without a trace. The first instances were subtle, one woman gone from a small farm, then another from a neighboring estate. But as the weeks passed, the disappearances became more frequent, more alarming, and utterly impossible to ignore. Plantation owners who had long relied on strict control, surveillance, and the constant threat of punishment to maintain order, found themselves facing a reality they could neither predict nor understand. Their carefully constructed systems of dominance, which had seemed unshakable, were now being undermined by forces they could not see or fully comprehend. Initially, the disappearances were dismissed as isolated incidents, the result of personal disputes or perhaps minor acts of rebellion. Yet as reports mounted, it became clear that something far more organized was at work. Entire groups of female slaves would vanish, leaving behind empty quarters, abandoned tools, and the lingering confusion of those left behind. Families were torn apart, households were disrupted, and the delicate balance of plantation operations was thrown into chaos. Slaveholders, accustomed to exerting near total control over the lives of those they enslaved, found themselves powerless to stop the exodus. The notion that these women could plan and execute their disappearances with such precision seemed impossible, and yet the evidence was undeniable. The mysterious vanishings triggered a wave of fear and paranoia among the white population. Plantation owners began increasing patrols, posting guards along the perimeters of their properties, and even hiring additional overseers to monitor the movements of their slaves. Each disappearance was met with frustration and disbelief. There were no signs of forced abductions, no physical evidence pointing to violence, and no trace of the women in the surrounding countryside. Rumors spread like wildfire, suggesting everything from supernatural interference to secret conspiracies. Some whispered that the women had discovered hidden pathways through the forests, while others insisted they had been aided by abolitionist sympathizers operating in the shadows. Despite the widespread panic, no concrete answers emerged, and the disappearances continued with relentless persistence. The psychological impact on both the enslaved and the enslavers was profound. Among the female slaves who remained, anxiety and fear were constant companions. Many wondered if they too might be compelled to flee or if the consequences of attempting an escape would be fatal. Yet beneath the fear, a quiet determination began to grow. Those who had observed the disappearances realized that the women who had vanished were not merely fleeing, they were orchestrating their freedom with remarkable skill and courage. This realization, though dangerous to acknowledge openly, sparked a glimmer of hope among others who longed for liberation but had yet to act. Meanwhile, the plantation owners faced a crisis of credibility. Their authority, which had previously been absolute, was now being openly challenged. Overseers who failed to prevent disappearances were reprimanded or dismissed, and neighbors exchanged anxious letters recounting their own inexplicable losses. Legal authorities were summoned to investigate, yet even their involvement failed to yield result. The disappearances were meticulously executed, leaving no evidence that could be used to trace the women's movements. Every attempt to capture or track them seemed to vanish into thin air, as if the enslaved women had become invisible within their own community. The logistics of the disappearances only added to the impossibility of the situation. Women managed to leave heavily guarded plantations, often traveling in groups to ensure mutual protection and coordination. They utilized the landscape to their advantage, navigating dense forests, rivers, and swamps with an intimate knowledge of the terrain that their captors lacked. They employed rudimentary signals, coded messages, and secret meeting points, all designed to evade detection while maintaining group cohesion. Their movements were calculated, deliberate, and precise, reflecting not only courage but also an extraordinary understanding of strategy and human behavior. In addition to their physical ingenuity, the women demonstrated a profound psychological resilience. They remained calm under the constant threat of discovery, often using misdirection, deception, and feigned compliance to outwit those who sought to capture them. Plantation owners, accustomed to fear and submission, were repeatedly outmaneuvered by individuals they had presumed powerless. Each successful disappearance reinforced the notion that these women were not simply fleeing, They were actively challenging the oppressive systems designed to control them. Their actions disrupted the social order in ways that were deeply unsettling to the slaveholding class. The disappearances also had economic ramifications. Plantations relied heavily on female labor for a wide range of tasks, from field work to domestic duties. Each vanished woman represented a loss of productivity, income, and stability. Plantation owners were forced to allocate resources toward recovery and security measures, diverting attention from the very operations that sustained their wealth. The financial impact compounded the social and psychological dimensions of the crisis, creating a sense of urgency and desperation among the white population that further highlighted the audacity and effectiveness of the women's action. As the months dragged on, the pattern of disappearances became impossible to ignore. Scholars and historians would later examine this phenomenon as a testament to the ingenuity, bravery, and resilience of enslaved women in the face of seemingly insurmountable oppression. At the time, however, those living through it were left with confusion, fear, and a grudging respect for the skill and determination of those they sought to control. The women's ability to vanish repeatedly, without leaving a trace or falling into the hands of authorities, challenged contemporary assumptions about obedience, power, and resistance. It demonstrated that even under the most restrictive and brutal conditions, human agency, intelligence, and courage could not be entirely suppressed. The story of these disappearances is remarkable not only for its scale and mystery but also for what it reveals about the human spirit. It shows how, even in the darkest corners of oppression, individuals can find ways to assert autonomy, protect one another, and pursue freedom against overwhelming odds. The female slaves of Virginia, by orchestrating their disappearances month after month, turned a system built on control and fear into a landscape of possibility, demonstrating that the desire for liberty, when combined with ingenuity and courage, can produce results that seem impossible to those who seek to enforce subjugation. As the disappearances of female slaves in Virginia continued, plantation owners and local authorities were plunged into a state of confusion and frustration. Unlike typical escapes, which could sometimes be traced through footprints, discarded belongings, or rumors, these vanishings seemed almost supernatural in their execution. Each time a group of women disappeared, the usual investigative methods failed to produce answers. Overseers reported searching cabins, fields, and surrounding woods, but there were no signs of struggle, no discarded tools, and no indications that the women had been coerced or harmed. The sense of helplessness among those tasked with maintaining control over the enslaved population grew with each new disappearance. The plantation owners, men who had long prided themselves on their ability to exert near total dominance, found their authority challenged in a way they had never experienced. They had relied on strict schedules, armed guards, chains, and fear to ensure compliance, and yet all of these measures proved insufficient. The women who vanished did so with a level of precision that suggested careful planning, coordination, and intelligence that the slaveholders had refused to acknowledge in their enslaved population. The idea that these women could outthink and outmaneuver the combined resources of multiple plantations was not just alarming, it was unfathomable to those who considered enslaved people as inherently inferior and incapable of strategic thought. In response to the growing crisis, authorities attempted to implement increasingly stringent measures. Night patrols were intensified, gates were locked earlier, and overseers were ordered to maintain constant surveillance. Some plantation owners even enlisted the help of local militias, hoping that the added manpower would prevent further disappearances. Despite these precautions, the women continued to vanish. The persistence of the disappearances further undermined the credibility of the men responsible for enforcing order, creating tension not only between the enslaved and their captors, but also within the hierarchy of the slaveholding class itself. Overseers, often blamed for lapses in security, faced public shame, threats of dismissal, and social ridicule, yet even their most diligent efforts failed to stem the tide of escapes. The authorities' inability to solve the mystery led to widespread speculation and fear. Rumors proliferated throughout Virginia, ranging from the rational to the absurd. Some whispered that the women were being secretly assisted by abolitionists, while others believed that they had discovered hidden paths or networks within the forests that allowed them to move undetected. The possibility that supernatural forces were at play was even entertained by some, highlighting the depth of anxiety the disappearances had created. These rumors were fueled by the stark reality that despite the surveillance, searches, and patrols, the women continued to evade capture with uncanny success. The psychological impact of this uncertainty weighed heavily on plantation owners, as it challenged their perception of control and their understanding of human behavior. The disappearances also had broader social implications. Neighboring plantations communicated about the mysterious vanishings, sharing reports, and speculating about causes. The collective anxiety created an environment in which every movement of enslaved people was scrutinized, and yet even with heightened vigilance the problem persisted. The women's ability to evade detection over an extended period suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond mere chance. Their actions indicated a deep understanding of their environment, knowledge of the routines and weaknesses of those in power, and the ability to coordinate with others in ways that plantation owners could not anticipate. This coordination, carried out without written records or visible means of communication, was a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the enslaved women. At the same time, the disappearances exposed the limitations of the slaveholding system itself. The belief that strict oversight, coercion, and the threat of violence could completely control the actions of enslaved people was proven false. The women's repeated escapes highlighted the inherent flaws in a system that relied on dehumanization and intimidation rather than mutual respect or genuine authority. Each successful disappearance not only provided a temporary reprieve for the women involved but also sent a message to those who remained, that freedom, while difficult and dangerous to attain, was achievable through courage, strategy, and collective action. The responses of the women themselves added another layer of complexity to the situation. Far from panicked or reckless, those who orchestrated the disappearances were deliberate, careful, and methodical. They chose the timing of their movements with precision, often departing under cover of darkness or during moments when attention was diverted elsewhere. They used natural features such as forests, rivers, and swamps to shield their movements and create barriers against pursuit. They also established temporary hiding places and safe locations, demonstrating foresight and planning that exceeded the assumptions of the men attempting to control them. These strategies were not the product of chance, they were the result of intelligence, experience, and an unwavering determination to secure freedom. The broader community of enslaved people played a critical role in these disappearances. Some provided guidance, shared knowledge of safe routes, or acted as lookouts, contributing to the success of the escape. These networks of solidarity and mutual support were essential, as the women navigating dangerous terrain relied on both information and assistance from others who understood the risks involved. The cooperation among enslaved people further frustrated authorities, who could not fathom how such coordination was possible within a population they sought to keep divided, isolated, and subjugated. The very existence of these networks challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying slavery, that fear and domination alone could prevent resistance and that enslaved people could be fully controlled. Economically, the disappearances struck a blow to the plantation system. Female labor was indispensable, responsible not only for domestic tasks, but also for managing gardens, livestock, and other essential work. Each woman who vanished represented a disruption to the operations of a plantation, reducing productivity and forcing owners to expend resources on increased security measures rather than on profit-generating activity. The cumulative effect of these disappearances was more than a mere inconvenience. It represented a tangible challenge to the authority and efficiency of the plantation economy. Owners who failed to prevent escapes were seen as weak or incompetent, further intensifying social and economic pressure. Over time, the persistence of these disappearances began to alter perceptions, even among the enslaved population itself. Witnessing repeated instances of successful escape inspired others to consider their own possibilities for freedom. The disappearances became symbolic, representing the potential for agency and self-determination even under the most oppressive circumstances. They demonstrated that fear and violence, while powerful tools of control, could be circumvented through intelligence, courage, and collective action. For those enslaved in Virginia, these acts of defiance offered both hope and a roadmap for navigating the treacherous path toward liberation. As the mysterious disappearances of female slaves in Virginia persisted, the frustration of the plantation owners and authorities reached unprecedented levels. Despite all measures taken to prevent escapes, the women continued to vanish, leaving behind only the evidence of their absence. Each new incident deepened the sense of helplessness among those in power, revealing the limits of the strict control they had long assumed was absolute. The perplexity stemmed not only from the frequency of the disappearances but also from the methodical manner in which the women executed them. Unlike typical escapes that might involve impulsive or desperate attempts, these disappearances were coordinated, precise, and remarkably organized, suggesting planning, intelligence, and a level of autonomy that the slaveholders had long denied existed among the people they enslaved. The inability to locate or trace the missing women frustrated plantation owners and authorities, who relied heavily on predictable routines and rigid oversight to maintain control. Each day brought new reports of vanished women, and despite increased security measures, patrols, and inquiries, no tangible leads emerged. Overseers, often under immense pressure to prevent further escapes, resorted to relentless monitoring, checking quarters repeatedly, and scrutinizing the behavior of all slaves under their supervision. Yet, their efforts were consistently thwarted. The women's departures left no footprints, no evidence of forced movement, and no indication that they had been coerced or assisted by outsiders. It was as though they had dissolved into thin air,
moving with a stealth and cunning that defied all expectations of human capability in that context. This repeated defiance of authority triggered not only practical concerns but also profound psychological reactions among the white population. Plantation owners, who had long believed that the combination of fear, punishment and surveillance guaranteed obedience, were forced to confront an unsettling reality. Their perceived dominance was not as secure as they had imagined. Each disappearance undermined the perceived infallibility of their control, and the constant questioning of their authority sowed seeds of doubt and unease. Rumors began to circulate, some grounded in fear, others in disbelief, as owners speculated about secret networks, local sympathizers or even supernatural involvement. These conjectures highlighted the deep anxiety generated by events that challenged the rigid assumptions underpinning the system of slavery. Among the enslaved population, the disappearances carried a different significance. For many, the news of successful vanishing acts was both inspiring and instructive. Women observed the methods used by those who escaped, noting the careful planning, strategic timing and use of natural landscapes to evade detection. They began to understand that the possibility of freedom, while fraught with risk, was achievable through careful coordination and courage. These incidents cultivated a culture of subtle resistance, where knowledge, ingenuity and solidarity became critical tools for survival and self-liberation. The disappearances demonstrated that the enslaved were not passive victims but active agents capable of extraordinary acts of strategy and bravery. The pattern of disappearances also highlighted the resourcefulness and intelligence of the women involved. They were acutely aware of the routines, weaknesses and blind spots of their overseers, using this knowledge to plan the timing and method of their movements. Forests, swamps, rivers and other natural features were leveraged as cover, providing both concealment and strategic advantage against those pursuing them. Temporary hiding places and meeting points were carefully selected and memorized, ensuring that the women could regroup and maintain cohesion while remaining undetected. This combination of environmental awareness, strategic thinking and collaboration showcased skills that the slaveholders had never anticipated and could not easily counteract. Authorities, desperate for answers, attempted increasingly elaborate measures. Night watches were doubled, gates were locked earlier, and patrols were extended into the surrounding countryside. Some plantations employed local militias or sought assistance from law enforcement officials to investigate the mysterious disappearance. Despite these efforts, no concrete evidence was found. The women's ability to anticipate, avoid and outmaneuver these measures further intensified the frustration of those in power. The repeated failures not only demonstrated the limits of brute force and surveillance but also emphasized the intelligence, planning and courage required to orchestrate such escapes. The economic impact of the disappearances was also significant. Female labor was critical to the functioning of plantations, encompassing fieldwork, domestic chores, childcare, and specialized skills necessary for maintaining daily operation. Each woman who disappeared represented a loss of labor, which disrupted productivity and forced plantation owners to allocate additional resources to compensate for the absence. This disruption had cascading effects, as the reduced efficiency impacted harvests, domestic management, and overall profitability. The women's disappearances therefore were not merely acts of personal liberation but also indirect challenges to the economic structures that benefited from their oppression. Over time, the recurring vanishings began to alter perceptions and expectations. The repeated success of the escapes fostered a recognition, however begrudging, that the women were capable of extraordinary strategic thinking. Their ability to execute coordinated disappearances over extended periods suggested a level of intelligence, resourcefulness, and resilience that directly contradicted the assumptions of the slaveholding class. This realization, while rarely admitted openly, began to influence the way enslavers approached surveillance, discipline, and the management of their enslaved population. The disappearances had revealed a fundamental vulnerability in the system of control, one that no amount of punishment or intimidation could fully remedy. The social dimension of these events was equally striking. Networks of support, communication, and cooperation among enslaved people played an essential role in enabling the disappearances. Knowledge of safe routes, secret locations, and timing was shared discreetly, often through coded signals, oral instructions, or subtle gestures. These networks not only facilitated individual escapes, but also created a sense of collective resilience and solidarity. For the women executing these disappearances, having allies and informants was crucial, allowing them to move confidently while minimizing the risk of capture. These acts of mutual assistance highlighted the strength of community and the importance of shared knowledge in navigating a system designed to isolate and control. The disappearances and their cumulative effect became a powerful symbol of resistance. They demonstrated that even under the most oppressive circumstances, agency, intelligence, and courage could produce outcomes that seemed impossible to those attempting to maintain control. Each successful escape served as both a tactical victory and a psychological blow against the system of slavery, showing that human determination and ingenuity could overcome the most rigid and brutal forms of domination. The women's actions not only challenged the assumptions of the enslavers but also inspired others to consider the possibilities of freedom and self-determination, fostering.
The mysterious disappearances of female slaves in Virginia not only challenged the authority of plantation owners but also sparked widespread rumors and fear throughout the surrounding communities. As the number of missing women increased, the white population became gripped by paranoia, unsure of how such acts could be occurring right under their noses. Plantation owners who had long relied on the perception of total control to maintain order were forced to confront a reality that contradicted every assumption they had about the people they enslaved. The disappearances seemed to mock their efforts, revealing weaknesses in their surveillance and security measures that had previously gone unquestioned. For those who had built their wealth and social status on the subjugation of others, this was more than a practical problem. It was a psychological shock that exposed vulnerabilities they had never imagined. Rumors quickly spread among neighbors, townspeople, and plantation communities. Stories varied widely, with some suggesting that the women had been secretly assisted by abolitionists or sympathetic outsiders who provided safe passage and guidance. Others believed that hidden networks of tunnels, paths, and hiding places existed, allowing the women to move undetected through forests, rivers, and swamps. In more extreme versions whispered in hushed tones at social gatherings, people speculated that the disappearances were the result of supernatural forces or curses, reflecting both fear and disbelief at what they could not explain. These rumors served to heighten the tension and anxiety, creating an atmosphere of suspicion in which even routine interactions were scrutinized. In response to these alarming reports, plantation owners and authorities implemented increasingly stringent measures, hoping to prevent further losses. Night watches were doubled, guards were placed along property lines, and overseers were instructed to monitor every movement of enslaved people with an almost obsessive diligence. Some plantations even sought assistance from local militias or law enforcement officers, attempting to establish a coordinated system of surveillance across multiple estates. Despite these efforts, the women continued to disappear, often in ways that outmaneuvered even the most comprehensive security measures. Each failure intensified the frustration of the slaveholding class and reinforced the perception that the women possessed a cunning and intelligence that had been underestimated. The disappearances also had a profound impact on the enslaved community. Women who observed the successes of others began to understand that freedom, though dangerous and fraught with risk, was attainable through careful planning, coordination, and bravery. The events fostered a sense of possibility and hope, demonstrating that strategic action could yield results even in the most oppressive circumstances. The women who remained on the plantations learned to recognize signals, listen for coded messages, and watch for signs of movement that might indicate opportunities for escape. Over time, these acts of defiance became part of a larger culture of resistance, in which knowledge, solidarity, and ingenuity were essential tools for survival. The skill and intelligence displayed in the disappearances were remarkable. The women demonstrated an acute awareness of the routines, patterns, and weaknesses of their overseers. They carefully chose the timing of their movements, often departing under cover of darkness, or during moments of distraction. Natural landscapes were used strategically to provide concealment, with forests, swamps, and rivers serving as both protective barriers and navigational aids. Temporary hiding places and meeting points were memorized and coordinated, allowing groups to regroup, share information, and maintain cohesion without leaving evidence that could be traced. This level of planning and strategic thinking challenged the assumptions of the slaveholders, who had long believed that fear and coercion alone were sufficient to ensure obedience. Authorities were repeatedly frustrated by the women's ability to anticipate and counteract security measures. Despite increased patrols, reinforced gates, and heightened vigilance, the disappearances continued unabated. Plantation owners facing repeated failures began to question the effectiveness of their strategies and even the competence of those charged with enforcing order. Overseers were reprimanded, threatened with dismissal, and sometimes publicly shamed for their inability to prevent the escapes. Yet no matter how thorough the measures, the women's ingenuity allowed them to outmaneuver the system, further eroding the perceived authority of the slaveholding class. The economic consequences of the disappearances were also significant. Female labor was essential to the daily operation of plantations, encompassing domestic chores, fieldwork, childcare, and specialized skills necessary to maintain productivity. Each woman who vanished represented a disruption to these functions, reducing efficiency and forcing plantation owners to allocate additional resources towards security rather than profit-generating work. Over time, the cumulative effect of these disappearances created a tangible strain on the economic viability of the plantations, illustrating that the women's actions were not only acts of personal liberation, but also indirect challenges to the structures that relied on their oppression. Networks of cooperation among the enslaved played a crucial role in enabling the disappearances. Knowledge of safe routes, temporary shelters, and optimal timing was shared discreetly, often through oral communication, subtle gestures, or coded signals. These networks were vital to the success of the escapes, allowing women to move with confidence while minimizing the risk of capture. The cooperation among enslaved individuals not only facilitated practical escape strategies but also fostered a sense of community and shared resilience. By working together, the women demonstrated that solidarity and mutual support could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances, challenging the notion that enslaved people were incapable of organization or independent thought. The repeated success of these disappearances had a profound symbolic impact. Each vanishing acted as a defiance of the authority that sought to control every aspect of their lives. The women's ability to execute coordinated, intelligent, and persistent escapes demonstrated that freedom was not merely a dream, but a tangible possibility achievable through courage, ingenuity, and cooperation. For the enslaved, these acts served as inspiration and instruction, revealing strategies and approaches that could be adapted to their own circumstance. For the slaveholders, they represented a challenge to the assumptions and structures of the system itself, showing that domination based solely on fear and violence was neither absolute nor unassailable. Over time, the disappearances came to embody the resilience and agency of enslaved women. Their actions illustrated that even under the most oppressive conditions, strategic thinking, careful planning, and courage could yield results that seemed impossible. Each successful escape was a testament to human determination and ingenuity, revealing that the desire for freedom could not be fully suppressed by brute force or intimidation. The disappearances reshaped perceptions, inspired hope, and undermined the very authority that had long relied on the unquestioned subjugation of others. The pattern of disappearances among female slaves in Virginia began to reveal a scope and audacity that stunned both the local authorities and plantation owners. Unlike isolated incidents, these vanishings appeared to involve multiple plantations and spanned significant geographic distances, suggesting a level of coordination that was almost impossible to comprehend. Women were not simply fleeing individually. Entire groups seemed to be executing disappearances simultaneously, or in quick succession, leaving behind an air of mystery and a growing sense of desperation among those who sought to maintain control. Each new case added to the mounting realization that the system of surveillance and domination was being systematically circumvented, challenging the very assumptions upon which slavery relied. The reach of the disappearances across multiple plantations meant that the authorities could not contain the problem by focusing on a single location. They attempted to communicate with neighboring estate owners, coordinating searches, sharing intelligence, and issuing warnings, but the women seemed always one step ahead. Their knowledge of the terrain, combined with the ability to move quietly and strategically, rendered most conventional attempts at recapture ineffective. Plantation owners were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The very women they believed could be completely controlled had not only found ways to evade them but had done so repeatedly and consistently, demonstrating a level of ingenuity and persistence that defied expectation. One of the most striking aspects of these disappearances was the way the women utilized their understanding of the environment. Dense forests, swamps, rivers, and other natural barriers became not just obstacles but allies, providing concealment and protection. The women carefully mapped routes in their minds using landmarks, natural sounds, and even subtle changes in the landscape to navigate without leaving evidence that could be traced. Their movements were deliberate, calculated, and highly strategic, reflecting both intelligence and experience in maneuvering through spaces that the overseers assumed were secure. The women's ability to exploit the terrain revealed an intimate familiarity with the land that had been denied acknowledgement by those in power, underscoring a disconnect between perception and reality. In addition to environmental mastery, the disappearances highlighted the women's psychological insight. They understood the routines and habits of those who sought to control them, recognizing moments of distraction, patterns of patrol, and points of vulnerability. By timing their movements to coincide with these lapses, the women maximized their chances of success. They also employed deception and misdirection when necessary, leaving behind traces meant to confuse or mislead pursuers. This combination of strategic thinking, psychological awareness, and physical skill allowed them to execute escapes that appeared almost impossible from the perspective of the slaveholders, who had long assumed that fear and supervision alone were sufficient to prevent such acts. The implications of these coordinated disappearances extended beyond the immediate loss of labor. Plantation owners were forced to reallocate resources towards security measures, often diverting attention from agricultural production and domestic management. The economic impact was significant,
As female labor was critical to the functioning of the estates, each disappearance represented not just a logistical challenge but a disruption to the entire plantation operation. The repeated losses over months strained both personnel and finances, highlighting the broader consequences of these acts of resistance. What the women achieved through coordination and courage had tangible effects on the economy of the slaveholding class, demonstrating that their actions carried consequences far beyond personal liberation. Authorities grew increasingly desperate to find explanation. They considered every possible cause, from covert assistance by abolitionists to the existence of secret networks of safe houses, but most ideas remained speculative. Searches of the surrounding countryside yielded little, and inquiries often led to dead ends. Plantation owners began to suspect that the women were sharing knowledge among themselves, communicating through subtle signals and codes that were nearly impossible for outsiders to interpret. This realization only added to the sense of impossibility surrounding the disappearances, as it suggested not just intelligence and courage but also sophisticated organization and cooperation. The repeated success of these coordinated disappearances had a profound effect on both the enslaved population and the communities that enforced slavery. For the women themselves, each successful escape reinforced confidence, resilience, and a sense of agency. They had demonstrated through careful planning and cooperation that freedom was not merely a distant dream but an achievable goal. For those who remained on the plantations, these acts served as inspiration and instruction, providing examples of how strategic thinking and solidarity could lead to tangible results. Within the slaveholding communities, however, the repeated failures undermined authority, instilled fear, and fostered paranoia. The women's success challenged long-held beliefs about obedience, control, and the limits of human capability under oppression. The disappearances also highlighted the importance of trust and solidarity among the enslaved. Successful coordination depended on careful communication, mutual support, and a shared understanding of risk. Women relied on one another for guidance, warnings, and assistance in navigating dangerous terrain. This collective effort was crucial in ensuring the safety of each participant and maximizing the likelihood of success. It also revealed the depth of communal bonds among the enslaved, countering the narrative imposed by slaveholders that division and isolation were inherent to the enslaved population. Through cooperation and mutual reliance, the women demonstrated that organization, planning, and solidarity could overcome even the most oppressive circumstance. Over time, the repeated disappearances became more than practical acts of evasion. They evolved into symbols of resistance, empowerment, and ingenuity. Each successful vanishing not only secured temporary freedom for the women involved but also communicated a powerful message. The systems of control imposed by slavery were not invincible. These acts exposed vulnerabilities in the structures of oppression, revealing that fear and violence alone were insufficient to suppress human determination and resourcefulness. For the enslaved, the disappearances embodied hope, courage, and the possibility of reclaiming autonomy. For the slaveholders, they represented a challenge to authority that could not be easily dismissed or remedied through conventional means. The cumulative effect of these coordinated disappearances illustrated the remarkable capabilities of those who were enslaved. The women combined intelligence, courage, environmental awareness, psychological insight, and collective action to achieve outcomes that seemed impossible within the context of slavery. Their ability to navigate complex social and physical landscapes while avoiding capture demonstrated both skill and determination. Each escape reinforced the notion that even in the harshest and most oppressive conditions, human agency, ingenuity, and resilience could produce extraordinary results. These acts of defiance, carried out with precision and persistence, challenged the very foundations of the system that sought to control them, leaving an enduring legacy of courage and resistance. As the mysterious disappearances of female slaves in Virginia continued, authorities and plantation owners became increasingly desperate to uncover the truth. The repeated failures to locate the missing women challenged everything they believed about control, obedience, and the effectiveness of their surveillance measures. Initially, plantation owners had assumed that these vanishings were isolated incidents, the result of impulsive actions or minor acts of defiance. Yet as reports accumulated over months, it became apparent that the disappearances were part of a larger pattern, coordinated and executed with astonishing precision. This realization unsettled the entire slaveholding community, as it implied not only courage and intelligence among the enslaved women but also a level of organization that had been consistently underestimated. Authorities began to implement more systematic investigations in an effort to understand the phenomenon. They dispatched search parties to the surrounding forests, rivers, and swamps, hoping to find traces of the missing women or evidence of the routes they had taken. Plantation owners offered rewards for information, interrogated those who remained, and increased patrols on properties both day and night. Despite these efforts, no meaningful leads emerged. The women seemed to vanish without leaving behind any evidence that could be followed. Footprints were obscured, belongings were left behind deliberately to mislead pursuers, and local communities offered no reliable guidance either out of fear, loyalty or complicity. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense of impossibility surrounding the disappearances, leaving authorities baffled and frustrated. The repeated success of these escapes forced plantation owners to confront uncomfortable truths about the enslaved population. For generations they had operated under the assumption that fear, punishment and rigid control could guarantee compliance. The disappearances shattered this notion, proving that enslaved people were capable of intelligent strategic planning and autonomous action that defied their captors' expectations. The women's ability to anticipate patrols, exploit weaknesses in security, and navigate challenging terrain demonstrated skills that the slaveholders had consistently overlooked or dismissed. Each vanishing was a reminder that their perceived dominance was contingent, not absolute, and that the systems of oppression on which they relied had inherent vulnerabilities. The ingenuity displayed by the women extended beyond physical navigation and concealment. They demonstrated remarkable psychological awareness, understanding the habits, routines, and blind spots of those attempting to control them. By carefully timing their movements and choosing optimal conditions for departure, they minimized the risk of detection. They also employed deception, misdirection, and subtle signaling to communicate with one another and maintain group cohesion. This combination of strategic thinking, environmental mastery, and psychological insight allowed them to execute disappearances that appeared almost impossible from the perspective of the plantation owners, who had long assumed that control through fear was sufficient to prevent such acts. The social dynamics among the enslaved played a crucial role in the success of these disappearances. Women who had previously escaped or observed successful vanishings shared knowledge discreetly, providing guidance on safe routes, temporary shelters, and time. Oral communication, coded gestures, and other subtle methods allowed information to spread without alerting overseers. These networks of trust and cooperation created a system of support that was essential for successful escape. The ability to rely on others while minimizing risk demonstrated not only intelligence but also the profound importance of solidarity in resisting oppressive structure. These cooperative efforts highlighted the capacity for organization and strategic planning among enslaved populations, which directly contradicted the assumptions of their captors. The repeated disappearances also had economic and operational consequences for the plantation. Female labor was critical to daily functions including domestic chores, childcare, fieldwork, and specialized tasks necessary for maintaining productivity. Each woman who vanished disrupted the routine operations, forcing plantation owners to reallocate labor resources and oversee. The cumulative effect of these losses over months created significant strain on the estates, as increased security measures and reduced labor efficiency affected both productivity and profitability. Beyond the immediate practical impact, these escapes also challenged the perceived control that owners held, illustrating that even with extensive resources, their dominance was neither absolute nor unassailable. Authorities and slaveholders speculated endlessly about how the women were able to evade capture so consistent. Some believed they were being assisted by outsiders sympathetic to the cause of abolition, while others assumed secret networks of safe houses and hiding places existed throughout the region. Still others proposed that the women had discovered natural advantages in the terrain that allowed them to remain hidden indefinitely. While the exact methods were not immediately clear, what was undeniable was that the women's planning, coordination, and skill enabled them to repeatedly outmaneuver forces that had far greater physical resources and social power. This repeated success created a sense of awe, fear, and disbelief among the white population, further intensifying their frustration and sense of vulnerability. The persistence of these disappearances also had profound psychological effects on the enslaved community. Witnessing repeated successes inspired others to consider the possibility of freedom and demonstrated that calculated strategic action could lead to tangible results. These disappearances became symbolic acts of resistance, reinforcing the notion that courage, intelligence, and solidarity could produce outcomes that were otherwise considered impossible under the oppressive system of slavery. The women's actions highlighted the agency of the enslaved and offered examples of how to navigate and exploit the weaknesses of a system designed to suppress human autonomy. Over time, the pattern of disappearances revealed a broader truth about the limits of control and the resilience of the human spirit. The women's ability to execute coordinated escapes over an extended period underscored not only their intelligence and courage, but also the importance of planning, cooperation, and perseverance. Their actions challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about obedience, hierarchy, and power, demonstrating that even under the most restrictive and dangerous conditions, human ingenuity and determination could achieve remarkable outcomes. Each successful escape served as a testament to the strength, resourcefulness, and resilience of those who refused to accept a life of bondage without resistance. The disappearances also emphasized the importance of knowledge and preparation. Women learned to navigate difficult terrain, anticipate potential threats, and use subtle means of communication to maintain coordination. These skills required careful observation, memory, and planning, all of which were employed to maximize the likelihood of successful evasion. The repeated ability to disappear without leaving traces demonstrated mastery over both environment and circumstance, showcasing a level of competence and foresight that confounded authorities who had assumed enslaved individuals were incapable of such strategic thought. Each disappearance, while representing a personal victory for the women involved, also carried broader social implications. By consistently outmaneuvering the systems of control imposed by the plantation owners and local authorities, the women demonstrated that resistance, when combined with intelligence and solidarity, could disrupt oppressive structures in meaningful ways. The repeated success of these acts of defiance provided both practical lessons and moral inspiration to others, illustrating that courage.
As the pattern of disappearances among female slaves in Virginia persisted, authorities and plantation owners began to realize that these were not random acts of rebellion or impulsive attempts at escape. What they were witnessing was a deliberate, highly coordinated effort by the women themselves. The realization that these disappearances were organized and methodical shocked those who had long assumed that enslaved individuals were incapable of planning or collaboration on such a scale. The women had not only identified weaknesses in the system of control but had also developed strategies to exploit them, demonstrating intelligence, resourcefulness, and courage that defied the assumptions of those seeking to dominate them. Each disappearance became a testament to their ability to think strategically under extreme pressure and in circumstances that were both physically and psychologically dangerous. These organized disappearances relied heavily on precise timing and intimate knowledge of the plantations. The women observed the routines of the overseers and plantation owners, noting patterns of patrols, the timing of meals, and moments when vigilance might lapse. They identified points of vulnerability in fences, gates, and other physical barriers, allowing them to plan routes of escape that minimized risk. By coordinating among themselves, the women ensured that each departure was synchronized with the others, creating diversions, reducing attention, and maximizing their collective chances of success. This level of coordination required trust, communication, and careful planning, all of which were executed with remarkable skill under conditions of constant surveillance. The use of natural terrain was another key element in these coordinated disappearances. Forests, swamps, rivers, and other environmental features were not merely obstacles but crucial allies that provided concealment, navigation, and protection. The women demonstrated exceptional knowledge of the landscape, memorizing landmarks, identifying safe routes, and creating temporary hiding spots that could be used repeatedly without detection. This understanding of the environment allowed them to move quickly and quietly, avoiding the patrols, hounds, and other measures employed to track them. The ability to manipulate the natural landscape in their favor reflected both practical skill and strategic insight, underscoring the ingenuity required to execute these escapes successfully. Communication and collaboration were essential components of the organized disappearance. The women used subtle signals, coded messages, and oral instructions to share information without alerting overseers or plantation owners. Knowledge about safe routes, temporary shelters, and timing was passed along discreetly, often through trusted intermediaries or by observing patterns in others' actions. This network of cooperation was critical, allowing women to plan departures, coordinate movements, and support each other throughout the process. The successful execution of these strategies revealed not only intelligence but also an understanding of social dynamics, trust, and the importance of mutual assistance under conditions of oppression. The psychological aspect of these disappearances was equally significant. The women had to remain calm and composed, even under the constant threat of discovery and punishment. They employed deception and misdirection when necessary, feigning compliance or creating distractions to divert attention from their true intention. This required not only courage but also acute psychological awareness, as they needed to anticipate the reactions of overseers and plantation owners while maintaining their own composure. The ability to manipulate perception, remain patient, and act decisively in moments of high tension highlighted the extraordinary mental resilience of the women orchestrating these escapes. The repeated success of these disappearances had broader social and cultural implications. Among the enslaved population, these acts became a source of inspiration, showing that freedom was possible through careful planning, cooperation, and courage. Witnessing these disappearances, other women began to consider the possibility of escape for themselves, learning from the strategies employed by those who had already succeeded. The coordinated nature of the disappearances emphasized that individual courage could be amplified through collective action, reinforcing the importance of solidarity and shared knowledge in resisting oppression. For plantation owners and authorities, the realization that these disappearances were organized was both alarming and humiliating. Their efforts to maintain control through patrols, surveillance, and punishment were repeatedly thwarted by a group they had underestimated. Each successful escape exposed vulnerabilities in the system of slavery, challenging the assumptions upon which their authority rested. The women's ability to organize, plan, and execute these disappearances highlighted a fundamental weakness. No amount of coercion or surveillance could entirely suppress intelligence, ingenuity, and the desire for freedom. The repeated failures of the authorities underscored the limits of power and control in a system that relied on dehumanization and fear. The economic consequences of these organized disappearances were also substantial. Female labor was critical to the functioning of plantations, encompassing both fieldwork and domestic responsibilities. Each woman who vanished disrupted operations, reducing productivity and forcing plantation owners to redirect resources toward increased security measures. The cumulative effect of these losses over months placed significant strain on the plantations, highlighting the tangible impact of the women's strategic action. In this sense, their disappearances were not only acts of personal liberation but also challenges to the economic and social structures that depended on their subjugation. The ingenuity of the women extended to the logistics of escape itself. Departures were timed to avoid detection, routes were chosen to minimize exposure, and temporary shelters were prepared in advance. The women demonstrated remarkable spatial awareness, memory, and planning, allowing them to navigate difficult terrain while avoiding pursuit. Even when challenges arose, unexpected patrols, environmental obstacles, or gaps in information, they adapted quickly, altering plans and improvising solutions without compromising their objective. This adaptability was a crucial factor in the repeated success of their coordinated escapes, and illustrated a level of strategic thinking that confounded authorities. Over time, the coordinated disappearances became symbolic acts of resistance. Each successful escape was more than a personal victory. It represented defiance against a system designed to suppress autonomy and enforce submission. The women's actions demonstrated that oppression, no matter how pervasive, could be resisted through intelligence, planning, and cooperation. For the enslaved community, these acts offered both practical lessons and moral encouragement, showing that freedom, while dangerous and difficult, was achievable through courage and ingenuity. For those in power, the repeated escapes were a source of fear, frustration, and reluctant respect, highlighting the limits of control and the vulnerability inherent in systems built on coercion rather than consent. The organized nature of these disappearances also challenged contemporary assumptions about gender, capability, and resistance. The women who orchestrated these escapes defied stereotypes that portrayed them as passive or incapable of strategic thought. They demonstrated leadership, planning, and resilience, showing that even under the most oppressive conditions, individuals could exercise agency, creativity, and tactical skill. These acts of defiance reshaped perceptions among the enslaved and indirectly among the slaveholding communities, revealing the profound strength, intelligence, and determination of those they sought to subjugate. The continued disappearances of female slaves in Virginia had begun to attract attention not only from plantation owners and local authorities but also from neighboring communities, who were astonished by the audacity and precision of these escapes. What made these disappearances truly remarkable was not simply that women were fleeing, but that they were doing so repeatedly, across multiple plantations and with such coordination that it seemed nearly impossible for the authorities to predict or prevent. Each successful escape challenged assumptions about control, obedience, and the capabilities of the enslaved, revealing that intelligence, courage, and careful planning could triumph even under the most oppressive circumstances. The women's ability to repeatedly vanish without leaving traces caused frustration, fear, and disbelief, forcing those in power to reconsider the limits of their authority. The planning behind these escapes was meticulous. The women studied the routines of overseers, guards, and even plantation owners themselves, identifying the exact times when vigilance waned and opportunities for departure were greatest. They observed patterns in work schedules, meal times, and night watches, using this knowledge to synchronize their movements and maximize the chances of success. Every detail mattered, from the placement of guards to the timing of conversations or distraction. By analyzing human behavior with precision, they were able to exploit weaknesses that the plantation owners assumed were invisible to those under their control. This demonstrated a combination of intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking that was rarely acknowledged by those who sought to dominate them. Environmental awareness played a critical role in the success of the disappearance. Forests, swamps, rivers, and other natural features were used not just as concealment, but as guides and protective barriers. The women memorized the landscape, noting landmarks, paths, and potential hazards to ensure safe passage. Temporary hiding spots were carefully selected,
and knowledge of these locations was shared only with trusted allies to minimize the risk of exposure. In addition to physical navigation, the women also demonstrated the ability to adapt quickly to unforeseen challenges, altering routes or hiding strategies when obstacles arose. This combination of foresight, adaptability, and environmental mastery allowed them to move with confidence, while avoiding detection by the very people tasked with controlling them. Coordination and communication were central to these disappearances. The women relied on subtle signals, oral instructions, and coded gestures to transmit information, ensuring that plans were executed without alerting overseers or plantation owners. Knowledge of safe routes, timing, and temporary shelters was carefully disseminated within trusted networks, allowing groups to move together or sequentially in ways that minimized risk. These networks of solidarity and cooperation were essential to the success of the escapes, as they provided guidance, reassurance, and mutual support. The ability to organize and execute these movements in secrecy highlighted not only intelligence, but also social skill, trust, and understanding of human behavior. Psychological strategy was another key component of the escape. The women maintained composure under extreme stress, employing deception, distraction, and misdirection to mislead those watching them. They could feign compliance or create diversions to draw attention away from their true intentions, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of perception and manipulation. This psychological acumen allowed them to exploit weaknesses in the overseer's vigilance and avoid detection during critical moments. The combination of mental resilience and tactical awareness was crucial in ensuring that the escapes were executed successfully, often under conditions of intense danger. The impact of these disappearances extended beyond the immediate loss of labor. Female slaves were integral to the daily functioning of plantations, performing domestic duties, fieldwork, childcare, and specialized skills that sustained the operation. Each vanishing disrupted routines, reduced productivity, and forced plantation owners to redirect attention and resources towards security measures rather than production. Over time, the cumulative effect of these disappearances created significant operational strain, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of the women's strategic action. Their escapes were not just personal acts of liberation but also indirect challenges to the economic structures that depended on their labor. Authorities and plantation owners speculated endlessly about how the women were able to evade capture so consistently. Some suspected assistance from abolitionists or sympathetic outsiders, while others believed in secret networks of safe houses or hidden pathways that had been established over time. Regardless of the speculation, the consistent success of the escapes suggested extraordinary planning, intelligence, and courage. The women's actions defied conventional understanding and confounded those who relied on brute force, intimidation, and surveillance to maintain control. Each disappearance served as a stark reminder that oppression could be resisted, even under the most restrictive and controlled conditions. The repeated successes of these escapes also had profound implications for the enslaved community. Witnessing women vanish successfully instilled hope and inspired others to consider the possibility of freedom. These disappearances became symbolic acts of resistance, teaching lessons about strategy, coordination, and courage. They demonstrated that even in a system designed to strip individuals of autonomy, careful planning, collaboration, and intelligence could yield extraordinary results. The acts also emphasized the importance of trust and solidarity, as success depended on the willingness to share knowledge, coordinated actions, and support one another in the face of extreme risk. The social and psychological ramifications for the slaveholding class were significant as well. The repeated failures to prevent disappearances undermined confidence, created fear, and instilled doubt about the effectiveness of the systems of control. Plantation owners who had long relied on authority, intimidation, and strict oversight were forced to confront the reality that their methods were not infallible. Each successful escape exposed vulnerabilities in the system and challenged deeply held assumptions about obedience, power, and control. The women's ability to consistently outmaneuver them created a sense of helplessness and highlighted the limits of domination. Over time, these disappearances evolved into a powerful narrative of resilience and agency. Each successful act demonstrated not only courage and intelligence, but also the potential of collective action and strategic planning. The women showed that even in the most oppressive circumstances, freedom could be pursued and achieved through careful observation, adaptability, and cooperation. Their repeated success undermined the authority of the slaveholding class while inspiring hope, teaching strategies, and demonstrating the capacity for agency and resistance. The disappearances were a testament to the human spirit, revealing the extraordinary abilities of those who refused to accept a life of bondage without action. In addition to their practical and symbolic impact, these disappearances highlighted the often overlooked skills and resourcefulness of women in particular. They demonstrated leadership, organization, tactical thinking, and resilience, challenging contemporary stereotypes that minimized their capabilities. By orchestrating coordinated escapes, they revealed that gender did not limit intelligence, courage, or strategic acumen. Their actions forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about the enslaved and highlighted the critical role of women in acts of resistance, planning, and collective survival. The repeated organized disappearances in Virginia became a story of remarkable ingenuity, perseverance, and determination. The women combined environmental mastery, psychological insight, strategic planning, and cooperation to achieve what seemed impossible. Their ability to escape repeatedly, avoid detection, and maintain cohesion over extended periods underscored the extraordinary capabilities that had long been ignored or dismissed by those in power. These acts of defiance not only provided personal liberation but also sent a powerful message about resilience, ingenuity, and the human capacity to resist oppression. As the months went on, the pattern of disappearances among female slaves in Virginia grew even more perplexing and alarming to the plantation owners and local authorities. What had begun as sporadic incidents had evolved into a sustained phenomenon, one that seemed to defy logic, expectation, and the resources of those tasked with maintaining control. Each new disappearance was executed with precision, leaving no traces, no evidence of struggle, and no indication of external assistance. The women who vanished were not simply fleeing individually, many were moving in coordinated groups, exhibiting a level of strategic planning that astonished observers. The repeated success of these escapes challenged every assumption about obedience, surveillance, and human capability that the enslavers had long relied upon. Authorities intensified their efforts to solve the mystery, employing increasingly elaborate tactics in hopes of preventing further disappearances. Plantation owners extended patrols, fortified boundaries, and demanded constant vigilance from overseers. Local militias were consulted, and communities were placed on alert, all in an attempt to regain control over a situation that seemed to be slipping beyond their grasp. Despite these extraordinary measures, the women continued to elude capture. Their disappearances were executed with a combination of intelligence, courage, and adaptability that left the authorities both frustrated and fearful. The women demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate the movements of those pursuing them, exploiting weaknesses in schedules, routines, and security measures with remarkable effectiveness. The women's use of the natural environment was a key factor in their repeated success. Forests, swamps, rivers, and other natural obstacles were transformed from barriers into tools of concealment and navigation. They memorized landmarks, identified safe paths, and established temporary hideouts that allowed them to evade pursuers while maintaining mobility. Their understanding of the terrain was not accidental. It was cultivated through observation, experience, and careful planning. Even when unexpected obstacles arose, such as sudden patrols, adverse weather, or changes in the landscape, they were able to adapt their plans in real time, demonstrating remarkable flexibility and resourcefulness under pressure. Coordination and communication were equally critical. The women relied on subtle signals, discreet oral instructions, and coded gestures to share information while avoiding detection. Knowledge of safe routes, potential hazards, and temporary shelters was passed selectively within trusted networks, ensuring that each participant had the tools needed to navigate dangerous situations. These networks of cooperation were essential to the success of the escapes, providing not only practical guidance, but also moral support and reassurance. The ability to organize such movements in secrecy reflected extraordinary intelligence, trust, and understanding of social dynamics under conditions of oppression. Psychological strategy was another vital element of these disappearances. The women demonstrated an acute understanding of human behavior, recognizing moments of distraction, vulnerability, or overconfidence among overseers and guards. They could feign compliance, create diversions, and employ misdirection to mask their true intention. This level of psychological acuity required both mental resilience and courage, as any error could lead to severe punishment or capture. By manipulating perception and exploiting predictable patterns, the women consistently maintained an advantage over those attempting to control them, highlighting the sophistication of their strategic thinking. The cumulative impact of these disappearances was felt across social, economic, and psychological dimensions. Female slaves were central to plantation operations, performing domestic chores, fieldwork, childcare, and specialized skills vital to productivity. Each disappearance disrupted these functions, reducing efficiency and compelling plantation owners to divert resources toward increased security. The economic strain created by repeated losses underscored the practical consequences of the women's strategic actions, revealing that their escapes were not only personal acts of liberation but also challenges to the structural foundations of the plantation system. The repeated successes of the women also had a profound effect on the enslaved population. Each act of escape served as a demonstration of what was possible, fostering hope, courage, and the belief that freedom could be pursued despite the risk. Observers learned from these examples, noting the strategies, timing, and techniques employed. The escapes became informal lessons in resilience, strategy and collective action. They reinforced the importance of solidarity, trust and shared knowledge, showing that coordinated action could overcome seemingly insurmountable barriers. This dissemination of practical and psychological strategies strengthened the community's capacity for resistance and self-determination. For the slaveholding class, the repeated disappearances were deeply unsettling. Each successful escape exposed vulnerabilities in the systems of control they relied upon. Plantation owners who had long assumed their authority was absolute were forced to confront the reality that intelligence, planning and courage among the enslaved could consistently circumvent surveillance and enforcement. The repeated failures of overseers, guards, and even militias eroded confidence and heightened anxiety, creating a pervasive sense of uncertainty and fear. These disappearances revealed the limits of coercion and surveillance, demonstrating that oppression, no matter how entrenched, could never fully eliminate human agency. The ingenuity displayed by the women extended beyond practical tactics to the broader art of survival. They displayed spatial awareness, memory, and foresight, understanding how to use terrain, timing, and coordination to their advantage. They anticipated challenges and adjusted their strategies as needed, demonstrating problem-solving skills that were both sophisticated and adaptable. Even in moments of danger, when the risk of capture was high, the women were able to maintain composure, evaluate options and execute plans with precision. This combination of mental and physical skill allowed them to perform acts of resistance that appeared nearly impossible from the perspective of those seeking to control them. Over time, the disappearances came to embody a larger narrative of resilience and defiance. Each successful act challenged the assumptions of slaveholders, revealing that oppression could be resisted through intelligence, courage, and collaboration. The repeated successes demonstrated that freedom, while difficult and dangerous, was achievable through careful planning and strategic action. The women's escapes became emblematic of the capacity for agency and resilience under extreme conditions, illustrating that even in the harshest circumstances, human determination could produce extraordinary outcomes. The repeated, organized disappearances also forced a re-evaluation of gender assumptions. The women orchestrating these escapes demonstrated leadership, strategic thinking, and tactical skill, defying contemporary stereotypes that minimized their ability. They showed that women were capable of coordinating complex operations, navigating dangerous terrain, and outsmarting opponents with superior resources and authority. Their actions challenged not only the institution of slavery but also societal notions about gender, intelligence, and capability, revealing the strength and ingenuity of those who were often underestimated and dismissed. Ultimately, the pattern of disappearances revealed the extraordinary combination of skills, intelligence, and courage possessed by the women involved. Their ability to evade capture repeatedly, coordinate actions across multiple locations, and utilize both psychological and environmental strategies underscored a level of sophistication that seemed impossible from the perspective of the authorities. These acts of resistance demonstrated the power of collective action, strategic planning, and unwavering determination in the pursuit of freedom. Each escape was not only a personal triumph but also a challenge to the systems of control, a disruption.
By the time the 10th wave of disappearances occurred, the situation in Virginia had become a crisis for plantation owners and local authorities. The repeated vanishings of female slaves over months had exposed profound weaknesses in the systems of control and surveillance that the slaveholders had long relied upon. Each disappearance was executed with remarkable precision, leaving no trace of the women's movements, no evidence of struggle, and no clear explanation for how they managed to evade capture. The frequency, organization, and daring of these acts of resistance had created a climate of fear, disbelief, and frustration among the white population, forcing them to confront the limits of their authority in ways they had never experienced before. The women who disappeared in these coordinated efforts exhibited extraordinary intelligence, resourcefulness, and courage. Their ability to anticipate patrols, exploit environmental advantages, and use psychological strategies to mislead pursuers demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that was rarely acknowledged by the slaveholding class. They had become adept at reading human behavior, recognizing moments of vulnerability, distraction, or overconfidence among those attempting to control them. By carefully observing routines, timing movements, and exploiting predictable patterns, the women consistently stayed one step ahead of their overseers, proving that intelligence and planning could overcome even the most repressive circumstances. The natural environment played a central role in the success of these disappearances. Forests, rivers, swamps, and dense undergrowth were not obstacles but tools that the women used to their advantage. They memorized paths, identified safe locations for temporary hiding, and created routes that allowed them to navigate large distances without detection. Knowledge of the terrain was shared selectively among trusted networks, allowing women to travel in coordinated groups or individually with minimal risk. The ability to manipulate and use the environment strategically demonstrated both practical skill and foresight, ensuring that even under the threat of pursuit, they could remain undetected. Coordination and cooperation were essential elements of the disappearance. The women relied on subtle signals, coded messages, and oral instructions to communicate plans without alerting overseers or plantation owners. Information about timing, routes, and safe locations was disseminated carefully within trusted networks, ensuring that each participant had the tools needed to execute their escape. This collaborative approach reinforced the importance of solidarity and mutual support in achieving goals that seemed impossible. The women's ability to organize complex movements in secrecy highlighted intelligence, leadership, and social skill, directly challenging assumptions that enslaved individuals were incapable of such strategic action. Psychological awareness and tactical deception were also crucial to the repeated success of these escapes. The women employed misdirection, feigned compliance, and created diversions to distract overseers and guards. They understood that perception could be manipulated and used this knowledge to their advantage. By maintaining composure under extreme stress and acting decisively at critical moments, they minimized the risk of capture while maximizing the effectiveness of their plan. The combination of mental resilience, courage, and strategic insight allowed them to outsmart those with far greater authority and resources, demonstrating a level of sophistication that left the slaveholding class baffled. The impact of these disappearances was felt across economic, social, and psychological dimensions. Female labor was essential to the functioning of plantations, encompassing domestic work, field labor, childcare, and specialized skills necessary for productivity. Each disappearance disrupted daily routines, reduced output, and forced plantation owners to allocate additional resources towards security. Over time, the cumulative effect of these losses strained operations and highlighted the broader consequences of the women's action. These escapes were not only acts of personal liberation but also challenges to the economic and social structures that depended on the subjugation of their labor. The repeated success of the escapes also had profound implications for the enslaved population. Witnessing women repeatedly vanish successfully fostered hope, inspired courage, and provided practical lessons in strategy, observation, and coordination. The acts demonstrated that even under extreme oppression, freedom could be pursued through intelligence, planning, and collective action. These disappearances became symbolic, teaching that solidarity, careful preparation, and adaptability could overcome formidable obstacles. Knowledge of successful tactics spread among the community, creating a culture of resistance that extended beyond individual acts and strengthened the overall capacity for self-determination. For the slaveholding class, the 10th wave of disappearances was particularly disorienting. The repeated failures to prevent escapes exposed vulnerabilities in the systems of control that they had long assumed were unassailable. Plantation owners experienced frustration, fear, and a growing sense of helplessness as each new disappearance revealed that their authority was not absolute. These events challenged deeply held beliefs about obedience, hierarchy, and the effectiveness of coercion. The women's repeated successes demonstrated that even the most rigid and oppressive systems could be circumvented through intelligence, courage, and planning, creating a profound psychological impact on those who sought to dominate them. The ingenuity of the women extended to the logistics of escape itself. Departures were carefully timed to exploit moments of distraction, using precise routes and safe locations to avoid detection. Temporary shelters were pre-arranged, and contingency plans were in place to adapt to unforeseen challenges, such as sudden patrols or environmental obstacles. The women demonstrated remarkable spatial awareness, memory, and planning, allowing them to navigate complex terrains efficiently. Even under high-risk conditions, they maintained composure and executed their plans with precision, illustrating a combination of mental and physical skill that consistently outperformed the measures taken against them. Over time, the organized disappearances took on symbolic meaning. Each successful escape was more than a personal triumph. It represented defiance against a system designed to suppress autonomy and enforce submission. The women's actions demonstrated that oppression, no matter how pervasive, could be resisted through intelligence, courage, and coordination. The repeated successes undermined the authority of the slaveholders while inspiring hope and providing strategic lessons to others within the enslaved community. These acts of defiance highlighted the capacity for agency, resilience, and ingenuity, showing that even in the harshest conditions, individuals could act decisively to reclaim freedom. The repeated disappearances also challenged contemporary assumptions about gender, intelligence, and capability. The women orchestrating these escapes displayed leadership, strategic thinking, and tactical skill, defying stereotypes that depicted them as passive or incapable of complex planning. They proved that women were fully capable of organizing coordinated operations, navigating dangerous environments, and outsmarting adversaries with superior resources. Their actions forced a reconsideration of the underestimated abilities of enslaved women, revealing extraordinary courage, ingenuity and determination. By the 10th wave of disappearances, it was clear that what had begun as isolated incidents had transformed into a sustained campaign of resistance. The women combined intelligence, environmental mastery, psychological insight, strategic planning, and cooperative networks to achieve outcomes that seemed impossible to those in power. Their repeated success exposed the limits of authority, disrupted economic and social structures, and demonstrated the profound resilience of the human spirit. Each disappearance was not only a personal victory but also a testament to the extraordinary capacity for strategy, courage, and collective action under conditions of extreme oppression. The mystery of the disappearing women in Virginia had finally revealed a truth that no plantation owner or authority could ignore. Freedom cannot be contained by walls, fences, or chains. Over months, the repeated vanishings had shattered illusions of control, exposing the limits of fear, intimidation, and brute force. The women had not acted recklessly, they had acted with intelligence, courage, and remarkable strategy, demonstrating that even in the darkest corners of oppression, the human spirit could find a way to resist and survive. What the slaveholders had labeled impossible was, in fact, the natural outcome of determination, planning, and unity. Their actions left a lasting impact not only on the plantations from which they escaped, but also on the wider enslaved community. Every disappearance became a story whispered in secret, a lesson in resilience, and a symbol of hope. Women who had once felt powerless now saw that freedom was attainable, not through violence or surrender, but through ingenuity, collaboration, and unyielding courage. Each escape demonstrated that oppression could be challenged not only physically but intellectually and strategically, and that solidarity among the oppressed was a force that could never be fully suppressed. For the slaveholders, the reality was undeniable and humbling. Months of effort, increased patrols, and enhanced surveillance had all been rendered ineffective. Their authority was challenged, their sense of control shattered, and their assumptions about the enslaved irreversibly shaken. The women's repeated success revealed an essential truth: power that relies solely on domination is fragile, and human resilience and intelligence will always find cracks to exploit. The legacy of these disappearances was a lesson in the strength of will, courage, and unity, proving that what was considered impossible could become reality when hope, determination, and strategy intersected. The women's stories endured beyond the plantations, entering the collective memory as a testament to resistance. They were more than acts of escape, they were acts of defiance, intelligence, and empowerment. They redefined what was possible under oppression, inspiring generations to come. Through their courage, planning, and unwavering spirit, they had rewritten the rules of control, showing that no system, no matter how brutal or sophisticated, could fully extinguish the drive for freedom. The impossible had been accomplished, and in doing so they left behind a legacy that would resonate far beyond the forests and rivers of Virginia, echoing as a powerful